real clear picture today. Okay.
I hope so. Oh, wait, thank you for reminding me. Actually, I wanted to, just in case, because there's some good material that I really want to make sure we save, just in case this dies again, stick my backup recording on, because it did work that other day in Kitisa when we lost the video, but at least I kept the audio. All right. Chazak, chazak, v'ni chazek. We are at the end of the book of Exodus. I know, wow. Does it seem like it's been a long time?
40 years.
40 years.
40 years. No, we don't get to the end of Exodus after 40 years. Although, technically, the book itself does take 40 years from Moses, well, actually 80 years from when Moses is born. When Moses leaves is 40 years, and then Moses comes back at his 80th birthday, ish. And then he spends 40 years through the next 3 books trying to get us to the border of Israel. So it's been a while. And who here felt that the last few chapters have kind of dragged a little? If you've, or who here actually just skipped the last few chapters, looking for more of the, and then they actually did something, went somewhere, had a story, had some narrative.
Is scanning acceptable?
Is scanning acceptable? It is best to actually read it, and that's kind of what we're going to use as our starting point. If you were to add up all of the sections of the Torah that people love to read, talking a big chunk of the book of Genesis, right? People love to read the stories of Abraham and Isaac and of Jacob, and the love with Rachel, and the surprise with Leah, and all of that. I mean, it's wonderful, and people read those over and over again. There was a big PBS show way back, was it the 80s or 90s, all about the book of Genesis, of people from different faiths reading it together, and it has this big movement and everything. And you get to Exodus and you hear the whole 10 Commandments story, that's to say, from the movie of the 10 Commandments, from the slavery of our people, the Exodus with all of the miracles and everything, and arriving at Mount Sinai. But that's only about half the book of Exodus. The other half are a whole bunch of laws and a whole bunch of details about building something. And in fact, there's these little slivers slipped in throughout that are powerful and amazing, and often get quoted or used as bumper sticker kind of slogans, but they're buried under this pile of detail of either things like the building of the Mishkan that we've been doing, or like we'll see when we get into the book of Exodus, the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, all of the details of the sacrificial rite. And it can almost feel like, how come these are so much shorter than the other parts that I don't like so much? It's like watching a 3-hour movie because there's a 5-minute scene that you really, really like. And indeed, that's why people scan or skim or read the abridged versions to get to the good stuff. They hit fast forward. And we're going to talk a little bit about the interplay that happens between the good bits and the not so good bits. And I'm holding that not so good bits in quotes. Because there's an argument that is not accidental, and you're not wrong for thinking that there are parts that are less captivating than others. You're not a bad Jew just because you find the discussion of sockets and planks and curtains less exciting than the discussions of our families and our morality. That puts you in good company. You still don't get to skip it, though. All right, so let's talk about the very end of all the stuff we've been doing. So we're in Pekudei. We're right at the end of the book of Exodus, and that means we're on page 570. And we're going to start off, we're in chapter 40, and we're starting with verse 17. Okay, so everyone find us? We're on 570.
Oh, we're back with building?
Well, yeah. Sorry, were you expecting something better?
Action,
a little action. You gotta wait for the payoff. You gotta wait for the payoff.
Okay, I'm waiting patiently.
Okay.
In the first month of the second year, on the first of the month, the tabernacle was set up.
All right, so just make sure, timeline here. All right, this is the second year of the Exodus. We've been sitting at Mount Sinai now for 2 years. If you blink, you missed it. That's not exactly, we get the 10 Commandments, we build the tabernacle, and we're moving a week later. It's taking time.
Moses set up the tabernacle, placing its sockets, setting up its planks, inserting its bars, and erecting its posts. He spread the tent over the tabernacle, placing the covering of the tent on top of it, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. He took the pact and placed it in the ark. He fixed the poles to the ark, placed the cover on top of the ark, and brought the ark inside the tabernacle. Then he put up the curtain for screening and screened off the ark of the pact, just as the Lord had commanded Moses.
One more paragraph.
He placed the table in the tent of meeting outside the curtain on the north side of the tabernacle. Upon it, he laid out the setting of bread before the Lord, as the Lord had commanded Moses. He placed the lampstand in the tent of meeting opposite the table on the south side of the tabernacle, and he lit the lamps before the Lord, as the Lord had commanded Moses. He placed the altar of gold in the tent of meeting before the curtain. On it, he burned aromatic incense, as the Lord had commanded Moses.
Okay. I'm going to stop here, not because the part's done, but because I can sense already you're getting bored. It's fascinating. It's interesting detail. But if we hadn't had the other dozen chapters about the building, if we hadn't had the sockets and the curtains and this many cubits and that many cubits and all of this, and we only went from 10 Commandments, laws, and then the actual description of the final step of construction, and they built the tabernacle, would you be okay?
Yeah.
Would you say, okay, yeah. They built the tabernacle.
Yeah, they put
Right?
some bread in
I
it.
didn't miss anything. Yeah, I mean, look, we got enough detail here that we know where stuff is where, we know what all the things are called, we know what's in the tabernacle, we know what it kind of sort of looks like, and I don't need to know if it's made from this color cloth or that color cloth, or if this is brass or if this is gold, or if this is enough detail. Right? It's like when someone tells you the story of their vacation.
Mm.
There's always a certain balance in the conversation of, do you really want to know exactly what the hotel room looked like, down to every single detail? And there was a clock radio to the side. It was one of those nice clock radios, the kind that allows you to set 2 different alarms. That way, if you want to get up slightly earlier, but you don't want to turn the alarm off completely because your husband likes to sleep a bit later on vacation. He doesn't normally do that at home, but on vacation, he likes to.
Right.
Maybe I'm giving a little too much detail. Right. So this may be the nice amount of detail. Or maybe even this seems like a bit excessive, which is why I kind of interrupted it, even though we're not done. So 2, 3, 4 paragraphs describe the major structure that stood in the middle of our people's settlements for the next 400 years. 4 paragraphs is enough. Maybe. Okay, let's go ahead.
Question.
Yeah.
It seems from reading these paragraphs like Moses did all this by himself.
There is absolutely that impression. So Moses delegated the work on the construction, that is to say, the preparing of all of the components. But Moses is the primary subject of the sentence. That's the grammatical term, right? He is the primary guy doing the verb. And there's a debate about whether he was the one who actually did all of it, or whether he engaged the Levites and those that were responsible for the different parts to actually do it. Because there's no way that he's moving the Ark of the Covenant by himself.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. It's gonna be.
It's heavy, exactly. And there's no way that he is hanging the curtain and holding the pole stable at the bottom simultaneously.
He's the project manager and the site supervisor.
Right.
No, I think he did some work.
Yeah.
He's hands-on.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
That was, by the way, that was a joke about project managers.
Yeah.
Right. It's very unlikely that he would have done it entirely himself, but it's likely that the Torah wanted to emphasize that he was doing it so that we were aware that everything was done exactly as it was supposed to be done. That he inspected, checked, and ensured that each and every step was carried out as God had commanded, as God had commanded, as God had commanded, as God had commanded. You may have noticed that little bit of a chorus going through this. Right. So I think that's the most likely explanation. Let's do one more paragraph, and then we'll get to the good stuff. See if you can tell when the good stuff comes.
Then he put up the screen for the entrance of the tabernacle. At the entrance of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, he placed the altar of burnt offering. On it, he offered up the burnt offering and the grain offering, as the Lord had commanded Moses. He placed the laver between the tent of meeting and the altar, and put water in it for washing. From it, Moses and Aaron and his sons would wash their hands and feet. They washed when they entered the tent of meeting and when they approached the altar, as the Lord had commanded Moses. And he set up the enclosure around the tabernacle and the altar and put up the screen for the gate of the enclosure.
All right. So now everything is complete, right? We've got from middle out, the whole tabernacle and its surrounding screen is done. Make sense? Makes sense. So now that the whole project is done, finally, after all these chapters, it's done. What happens next?
When Moses had finished the work, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the presence of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the presence of the Lord filled the tabernacle. When the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out on their various journeys, but if the cloud did not lift, they would not set out until such time as it did lift. For over the tabernacle, a cloud of the Lord rested by day, and fire would appear in it by night, in the view of all the house of Israel throughout their journeys.
Did we get some good stuff?
Yeah, that's real drama.
That's some drama. Okay, so give me the drama that just happened here. Malka or anyone else that wants to chime in.
You know, you built this tabernacle specifically by instruction,
Mm-hmm.
and then you get this cloud coming down, and if you don't have the cloud, you have fire. And I wonder if the cloud to me looks like an acceptance, but the fire looks like denial.
Usually fire is considered to be a positive metaphor when it comes to God.
Okay.
You have to think of the altar and the lighting of the altar, which
Yeah,
we're going to get in the
okay.
book of Leviticus, is a fire from heaven. So generally fire is considered positive,
Okay.
as well as the cloud. But you're right, the special effects here, the visuals are great,
Yeah.
right? We've built this whole Mishkan, and it does seem kind of like a big seal of approval that God is saying, "Ooh, what a nice place you built for me. Let me just settle down into here and let my cloud sink in and burn with this fire." It does seem like a seal of approval, and it's a very dramatic, visual, palpable way. I mean, wouldn't it have been a little anticlimactic if they'd gone through all of these chapters after chapters after chapters of building, and they said, and Moses drove the final peg in, and then he went home to go to sleep? We want something that says, yay, it's working. Turn it on. Show me what it does.
But it says Moses couldn't go in.
But then we get this weird problem.
Does that mean nobody could go in?
If Moses couldn't go in, who else could?
So here you built this whole thing for 4 chapters.
The overall instructions took a lot longer than just 4 chapters, but
So is it a case of be careful what you wish for? God's presence should come and dwell
right.
among us. However, I can't use the tabernacle.
So Moses puts the last peg in, and then boom, the cloud is there, and it's like my best impersonation of a mime. He's not allowed to go through. Well, what did I build it for? I mean, I built it just so God could come and squat on it, and now we can't use it. Aren't we supposed to do stuff in there? We have this whole altar thing. There's the incense. There's the menorah to light. The lechem panim, the bread that's placed. I mean, we've got instructions of sort of what we're supposed to do there. We get a lot more detail in the next book. But what happened? Now I don't get to use it. It's like, you build a jacuzzi and one neighbor comes and jumps in it because he thinks it's for him, and now I can't use it. Like, well, what did I build this for? Okay, so we got some good stuff here. And I'm glad that you're noticing some of the details of it. You might be surprised to learn you're not the only people in Jewish history who have noticed some of these details. There you go. Let's see if I can go further. Yeah, my superpowers are still in development. They're supposed to arrive next week.
Oh, okay.
All right. So we're going to start off with a commentary from Ralbag, a brilliant French darshan, expounder on the Torah from around the 1200s. And we'll start off with the question that is on all of our minds.
Why is there so much unnecessary repetition in this story, and indeed in many of the stories of the Torah? No explanation has been found that is sufficient to cover every example.
All right, so take a deep breath. You are in the company of one of the great rabbis of Jewish history. If you think that you can't come up with a simple one-sentence explanation for all of the repetition of the Torah that does not immediately seem to be necessary, okay? You're normal. That's right. The Torah does not seem to be edited very evenly. If we were to send this to a proofreader or to a good editor, they'd probably say more of this whole cloud stuff and God moving in, because that's really cool and dramatic, and people are going to want to know about that, and less about the sockets. Okay, a little OCD there. Tone down the construction. I think the last 4 paragraphs, that's probably enough, but we can probably get rid of the other chapter. And he's saying, yeah, if you try to come up with an explanation for why there's so much of some and so little of others, well, we're going to get to the little in a minute, you can't come up with a one-size-fits-all explanation for why there's this imbalance. He's going to give us a possible explanation.
It may be that it was the custom in those days to have a great deal of repetition in stories, and the prophet spoke according to this custom.
So this is about 2,000 years after the Torah was given, but it's still 1,000 years before our current time. And he's saying back in those days, I know we don't always think of the people in the Middle Ages as being modern, but from their point of view, they were modern in their days. And they look back in the Torah days and said, well, back in the old days, maybe that's just what people did. They repeated details and stories a lot. That might have just been the fashion. And the Torah was written for their fashion. It was written in their style. By the way, Relbag is in some ways right on this hypothesis that some of the repetition may have been a stylistic convention. Now that we have unearthed more fragments of other ancient Near Eastern literature, we do find that they contain often details that the rest of us are not terribly interested in, that they contain repetition of things that we don't see immediate reason for. So it may indeed have been a literary style of why they did this. It's equivalent to imagine someone 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, reading Shakespeare and going, why does he keep rhyming all the time? I mean, no one goes around talking and rhyming. You finished every sentence with a rhyme, people would think you were a bit peculiar. But it was the fashion of theater in the days of Shakespeare. And if you read through a lot of other plays in Shakespeare's time, you find that people did that all the time. So Shakespeare wasn't being weird. He was only being normal to his convention, which happens to be weird to ours.
The idea of repetition is even, in business and military communication today, you have the 3-part briefing. Tell them what you're going to tell them,
Right.
tell it to them, tell them what you told them.
Exactly.
So that, it takes that long for people to really incorporate what it is you're trying to get across.
Exactly. But that forces us to ask the inverse question, which is, why does the Torah spend so much time repeating things like sockets and so little time repeating other things like don't murder,
Right, that's true.
that we might find more powerful, or not even necessarily repeating laws, because, okay, fine, laws you don't need to say too many times, but wouldn't it have been nice to have more details in the story of Moses? He goes from being born to 40 in about 2 sentences. Wouldn't you have liked some detail there? I mean, he lived, so he must have been doing something. Tell me about what was it like when he was in middle school? Something. But we didn't get any of that. Couldn't we have cut down this stuff and put it there? And Relbag's going to offer us a rather interesting take on this idea.
But perhaps the Torah is so long-winded in these many harmless places to show us that when it is brief in profound places, it is not simply a matter of style.
All right, make sure we get this. He's saying the reason the Torah is expanded here and brief there, expanded in the, I really am uncomfortable with this choice of words, long-winded, expanded into the seemingly unnecessarily repetitive areas. Long-winded is shorter. And it is brief in the profound, isn't because the Torah doesn't know how to be long-winded, right? It's not that you don't know how to be long-winded. The Torah chose not to be long-winded in the profound areas. that's an important realization, right? Because when you're reading something that is written by an author, even capital A author, you have to wonder what was the range of style available to the author of why they chose to do this or didn't choose to do that. If it wasn't even on their palette, you know, if the painter didn't have blue, then you shouldn't be surprised that the sky isn't blue. And what he's saying is that the Torah knows how to go on and 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 on. It shows us that. So when it doesn't go on and on and on and on, notice it, because it's doing it deliberately. It's being brief on purpose, not by accident. It's not that the author ran out of things to say on this topic.
We are thus awakened to the necessity of seeking the reason for the Torah's brevity in these profound places, which we must attribute to the nature of the subjects discussed in them. In such places, every aspect of the text must be examined in order to discover their true meaning.
All right. So what he is essentially saying is that you may have two sections of the Torah, like the construction of the Mishkan and the presence of God dwelling in the Mishkan. And this one may be huge in length of text, and this one may be minuscule in length of text. This is not drawn to scale. If you were to draw this to scale, this would be too small for me to put my little red filler in. It is red, right? But what he's saying is this one, when it comes time to understand it, is a little bigger than it started, right? If you go to explanation, you're going to get a little bit more content out of it than just the surface reading of the text. When you explain it, you're going to notice a few things and some parallels. We've done this for the last few weeks as we've gone through these texts. But he says when you take this section and you start explaining it, it's going to be like that. And indeed, the irony is, not the irony, but the realization is that when you look in any traditional commentary on the Torah, this is exactly what happens. Mm-hmm. You will find that brief passages will often elicit giant commentary. Mm-hmm. And long passages will get very little commentary at all, just occasional explanations to make sure you understand the technical terms. And he's saying that was planned. Mm-hmm. And doing this is what we need to do when we see that. When we see a short section that sounds important and meaningful, we don't just say, oh, I wish God said more. We say, what did God say in these tiny clues that were given to us? Because there must be something precious here. So let me find it.
Yeah, and Rabbi, it does seem that this stylistic approach to communication has also, I don't know, evolved down through the ages in terms of humanity, in the sense that, you know, it's often referred to, whether it be a parent, somebody in a business setting, mm-hmm. a locker room, they don't say a lot, but when they say something, mm-hmm. everybody listens.
Exactly right.
And you know, there is that idea that parsimony, mm-hmm. you know, oftentimes can have incredible value.
Exactly right. Yoda is Yoda,
right?
Because he only says like 12 things.
Exactly.
And that's what makes him profound.
Right.
Aphorisms, proverbs, pithy sayings, they are important because they are brief. And when you try to understand what they're saying, you plumb the depths of those few words. Right? When someone is giving a speech, they'll often pause before they give the important part. Mm-hmm. And the important part will be a quick summation of what they are trying to say, but they grab your attention by the emptiness, and then they put it into a neat package by that summation. And that summation is not going to be the long-winded part. It's going to be the punch that comes. So yeah, we duplicate this style, and Ralbag is saying, so treat the Torah with the same care. Investigate where it is brief but profound, because there is more there than the brief words might have made you think. All right, so let's take a look into these brief words and see what in the world is going on. So one thing we need to uncover of the covering is that we have a term that's used here for presence of the Lord. If you look in the Hebrew, you'll see that the word that is being used here is kavod. Do we have any Hebrew mavens here that can give a general translation of kavod? I'll give you a hint. It's not usually translated as presence.
Translated as honor,
Honor or glory,
glory.
right? Glory or honor is kavod, right? So when someone does a great job at something, we might say to them, kol hakavod, right? It's like, wow, what great glory you've attained for yourself. What honor. If, you know, it's a kavod to do to be given, it's a great kavod to be given an aliyah on Rosh Hashanah. It's a great honor to be given an aliyah on Rosh Hashanah. And so kavod generally means honor or glory. But the kavod Adonai, the glory of God, the translation has already tried to take and put it into the words that might be an interpretation, which is presence. If you wanted to be literal, you could say the glory of God or the honor of God rested upon the tabernacle or filled the tabernacle. And that doesn't exactly answer the question, but at least it gives us more flexibility when it comes time to analyzing it, because the word presence is already going down one interpretive path. It's not a bad path, and there's a lot of reasons why that path is used as the translation here, as we'll see. But if you think the only word that could be used is presence, you've shut yourself off to the other options that the word glory might give. Okay, so first option, Ramban.
The cloud would cover it on every side until it was totally hidden. The interior of the tabernacle was filled with the presence,
Kavod.
which dwelt inside the cloud, inside the tabernacle, as when Moses approached the thick cloud where God was.
Okay, so what Ramban is trying to give us here is a quick summation of the literalness of what's happening here. He says, yeah, there was the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and there was a cloud over the tabernacle, and in the cloud was this presence of God, and that presence was there whenever Moses went there. All right, so what is he trying to distinguish here? What's he trying to make sure we don't make it as a mistake?
God himself is not in the temple.
Okay, so one point is whether God himself is or isn't, and actually we're going to have to wrestle with that a bit more. But one thing he's definitely saying is God isn't the cloud. Right? He's saying the cloud covered and the interior was filled with the presence. Right? God is not the cloud droplets, if you will. God isn't the cloud. God's presence is within the space that the cloud demarcates. So he's already trying to help distance us from this idea that somehow God is a cloud. God isn't a cloud. It's just when God is home, the cloud's there, would be one way of putting it. It's sort of like the flag on Buckingham Palace. When the queen is in residence, they raise a certain flag on the top of the palace. When the queen is not in residence, that flag is not there. The queen is not the flag. Make sense?
Mhm.
Okay. Onward for Ramban as he tries to analyze it further. The point.
The point of our verse is that Moses could not enter the tent without permission.
Right, because it says, and Moses couldn't enter the tabernacle. And he's saying this is about permission, not about the inability. Thank you.
But if God called him, he could enter the cloud just as he did on Mount Sinai.
Right, remember there was a cloud on Mount Sinai, and Moses went up Mount Sinai and did the whole, got the Torah thing from God. So apparently the cloud itself is not a barrier. It is simply an indication that Moses doesn't have free access. He's waiting for permission, not the ability.
The straightforward sense of Leviticus, which says...
Well, by the way, Leviticus 1:1, guess where that is?
Next chapter.
Next chapter, first verse.
Oh.
Right, which begins with Vayikra, which is?
The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. And the sense of that, straightforward sense, is that Moses stood at the entrance of the tent of meeting to speak with him without going in.
Right, so Moses came up to the tent, and then God Vayikra, and then God called to him, and then he came in. So what Ramban is saying is that we don't have here a problem that Moses could no longer go into the tabernacle. What we have here is that Moses doesn't go into the tabernacle uninvited anymore. When he was just building it, when they were just doing construction, yeah, you had to move around and, you know, hang this there and insert that into tab A and all of that. Once it was done, you do not treat it with that same level of casual familiarity that you do when you're building it. It would just be like, in the old days, if you had all your kids helping you build the house, that doesn't mean when the house is done, they can walk into the master bedroom anytime. They may have helped build it, but they don't get permission to come whenever they feel like it, once it's actually built and in use. And that's what the distinction Ramban is trying to make here.
Our sages contrast the phrase Moses could not enter the tent of meeting,
which is what we just had,
with the phrase in Numbers, Moses went into the tent of meeting, and say that the second part of our verse must be translated not because the cloud had settled on it,
which is the top of page 572.
But when the cloud had settled.
Right? So it's not that Moses couldn't go into the tent because of the cloud. It's Moses couldn't go into the tent when the cloud was there. Right? And they're taking this as being as a permission issue rather than an ability issue.
For in their opinion, the Numbers verse suggests that Moses could go into the tent whenever he wanted to without being called. But since that verse continues, he would hear the voice addressing him from above the cover that was on top of the ark, it appeared to them that Moses must have stood inside the tent before the ark.
All right, so this is classical rabbinic midrashic technique, and he's drawing from the sages from our ancestors. Which you have one text which says Moses couldn't go in. You have another text that says Moses goes in. They're in different sections of the Torah. What do we do? Could he or couldn't he? And they say, well, you take a third text and you use it as a mediator to help you understand how all three texts must be right. And so they're saying he couldn't go in without permission, but when he had permission, then absolutely he could go in and speak to God from above the ark, where he would receive his revelation and the ongoing process during the wilderness. So you tie them all together, you come up with an answer that makes all of them work in harmony, even though individually they might have seen in contradiction. Make sense? Yay, rabbinics.
So the tent of meeting is not the place where all the Israelites met, because there was a million of them or so.
Right.
So they couldn't all fit in there anyway.
No. Yeah, this was not a sanctuary.
Between Moses and God.
Correct.
Okay.
When we talk about meeting, we're primarily talking about Moses and God, although one can also argue that because of the nature and the spiritual aspects of the sacrificial service, this was also a place where the individual person met God in that service. They just didn't get to go inside. So it still, as a unit, was the tent of meeting, even though they couldn't go into the innermost chamber of it.
Right.
All right, makes sense? All right, so okay, we're done. All right, we figured out what the problem is. Moses could go in, couldn't go in. We've sorted that out. We've covered our explanation, right? Now we still got more time and we still have more pages. Okay.
Oh.
I never let people go home early.
Moses could not enter the tent of meeting at the moment when it was set up, because the cloud had settled upon it immediately to show the Holy One's love for Israel.
Right. So as Malka said, this was a sign of approval and a sign of that we should rejoice that God indeed liked what we had built and that we had built it appropriately, and therefore God approved of it. So this was God's way of saying, I love the sweater you knitted for me.
Yeah.
Let me try it on right here and now, which, by the way, I was always taught was the polite response. Someone gives you a sweater, you put it on. You don't have to put on, trousers or socks, but if someone gives you a sweater, you put it on, you say how lovely it is and doesn't it look nice, and everyone can compliment what a good fit it is. You do it immediately. You don't say, oh, great, I'll wait and I'll try it on later. So God's being polite.
Afterward, the cloud withdrew from the tent and settled on the ark. There I will meet with you, and I will impart to you from above the cover, from between the two cherubim that are on top of the ark of the pact, all that I will command you concerning the Israelite people.
All right, so this is a slightly different version of what happens with the cloud. All right, this is, if I remember correctly, from Rashbam. Yes, and Rashbam is saying, no, it's not that the cloud would invite Moses in and out. It was the cloud settled on the whole tent, and then it withdrew to the innermost part of the Holy of Holies, where the ark was, and the cloud was localized just there between the wings of the cherubim on top. And that's where the cloud hung out. And it only covered the whole tent at this initial time, just to show everybody how much God liked the tabernacle.
What about the fire at night?
We'll get there. We'll get there. Keep going.
Then Moses entered the tent of meeting. When Moses went into the tent of meeting to speak with him, he would hear the voice addressing him from above the cover that was on top of the Ark of the Pact between the two cherubim. Thus he spoke to him.
Which we also find later on in the Torah. So it seems to be corroborating this interpretation.
You find the same phenomenon in the temple, where it says, the cloud had filled the house of the Lord, and the priests were not able to remain and perform the service because of the cloud, for the presence of the Lord filled the house.
Right,
That's
which
in
was
1 Kings.
exactly what happened when Solomon built the temple.
When the temple was complete, the Holy One would sanctify it with the cloud, and afterward would diminish his presence until it rested atop the ark between the poles.
All right. So he's saying not only is this what happened with this Mishkan, this is what happened with the Temple of Solomon as well, which is you get the visuals, the drama of the cloud resting and filling the entire thing so that everybody has to back out. And then God contracts so that there is room for us to go about doing the service and using the facilities as they were intended by God, with God's presence still being there, but not so expansive that we have no room to act.
So that's how we get that our synagogues are not a house for God. They are a house of assembly for us, and God occupies that full presence near the ark, but it is a place of assembly for the Jewish people to be in as well.
It's definitely meant to be for us, because God doesn't need a house,
Right.
but we do need a place where we can do these things. Notice as well, this is a metaphor that is taken up later on by the mystics. The idea that godliness, God'sness, expands to fill the entire universe and more, and God had to contract, tzimtzum, to withdraw some of his presence in order that there was room for us to act, or else we would be swimming in a sea of God, so to speak. And how could we act counter to God if we were submerged within God's presence 24/7? Right? With God acting 100% all the time, full force, there's no room left for human agency. And God has to contract in order to give us room to act. Now, whether or not you see that as a full literal metaphysics, or whether you see it as a metaphor for the notion that God has given us free will, both of them come from this image of God resting and then contracting. Make some sense? All right, we're filling in our slots here pretty well. Okay. By the way, I did have to cut down all the things that were said about this for just today, but there's a lot more that is said by other commentaries. All right, let's get back to this cloud.
Whoever is attentive.
Oh, sorry, that's right. Rashbam has this wonderful little thing which I couldn't skip because I love it. It has nothing to do with the direct topic of our discussion, but I just can't skip it because it's nice.
Whoever is attentive to the word of our Creator, let him not stray from the explanations of my grandfather Rashi, and do not budge from them.
All right, so Rashbam was Rashi's grandson, and Rashbam added his own commentary to his much more famous grandfather's commentary of the Torah. And one might think, does that mean Rashbam thought his grandfather was wrong? And was he being disrespectful? And what is he saying here? No. Everything Granddad said, A-okay.
Right? For most of the laws and midrashim in them are close to the straightforward meaning of the texts, or can be derived from superfluous expressions or variations in the language.
Right? No, my granddad, he was on target for how we do Judaism, on how halakha works and how the traditional midrash explains these things, and the way that it is explained. So what Granddad did was an amazing service and should not be let go. Even though I added my own interpretation in a few places where I thought that what he was giving was absolutely the traditional interpretation and application, but I needed to clarify in context that I thought it might have meant something by itself were we not informed by this broader tradition.
Right? It is best that you grasp what I have explained without letting go of what he said.
It's not either or, people. Right? When it comes to commentary, it's not, I agree with this one, which means I must agree or disagree with that guy. I can agree with Rashbam and I can agree with Rashi. the old famous opening scene in Fiddler on the Roof, right? He's right. He's right. You're both right. It's like, how can they both be right? You're right. Yeah, just because two people are right doesn't mean that you're wrong. You can grab hold of both, even when they are mutually contradictory, if they are both saying something true, which is going to be made even more clear in Abarbanel's next comment.
This was not a natural cloud that formed from water vapor, but a cloud created ex nihilo.
That means out of nothing.
By God on the first day of creation, as Genesis calls it, a darkness over the surface of the deep.
Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what I did with my editing there, but yes, so this cloud isn't just your regular cloud. This cloud is the cloud that was created way back in your very, very beginning of the book of Genesis, and God had been keeping it idling to be used as the symbol of God's presence for this very special occasion. And if you were to go in there and take a sample of the cloud, you're not going to find water vapor. It's going to be something substantially different, because this is not just a regular natural phenomenon. And
there are many parallels between the story of creation and that of the tabernacle. I have interpreted some of the verses in the story of creation differently in my commentary there than I do here to fit the interpretation to the context, but there is no contradiction. The Torah has 70 faces.
Which is a classic quote from Pirkei Avot. The idea that there are 70 facets or faces to the gem of Torah. And apparently he has two himself. Right? Abarbanel is saying he has two faces. That sounds wrong. Abarbanel is saying that, yes, I gave a commentary in the book of Genesis about what was happening there that is different than my commentary to the tabernacle, which was comparing it to Genesis, because there are very important parallels between the two, the creation of the world and the creation of this sacred space. The fact that I gave two different interpretations to the same thing is not a problem. Right? I'm not contradicting myself. I am not flip-flopping. I didn't change my mind. There I was explaining it in that context. Here I am explaining it in this context. Deal with it.
And that's
the Torah is robust.
And that's what Rashbam said. My grandfather said one thing, I'm
Exactly
saying another.
right.
They're both true.
Right, and even for yourself, which is why I love Abarbanel on this. Even for me, I'm allowed to have two different opinions in different contexts, because the Torah is big enough to accommodate that. The Torah has 70 faces, which 70 is really just a round number, meaning a myriad, a whole bunch of. So it's just a beautiful statement of, this is how we end up filling this space, is because there are multiple layers and multiple opinions that are necessary to get to all of the depths of this one slice. All right, let's get to one of the more deep parts of what's happening here.
And that's what that one said.
So Forno's going to lead us into it. Yeah.
And this happened, that is a cloud, Jimmy.
Mm-hmm.
The cloud happened the instant that Moses had completed all the work necessary to achieve it.
All right, seems like a throwaway line, which if you remember your Ralbag, means it's not.
No,
Right? Just because it's not long-winded doesn't mean it's not important. In fact, the inverse. So what is Forno trying to drive home with this insight, which seems almost like new? Did someone say otherwise? So think for a moment about the difference in the visual. Moses takes and he puts the last peg in place. The whole Mishkan is done. He steps back and all the people gather around and they're admiring the handiwork that has taken them so long to put together and so difficult. They're in the wilderness and everyone's saying, oh yeah, I did that panel and I did that socket, and I wish I could go back and see the ark, and don't worry, it'll come out the next time we break camp and all of that. And then slowly the cloud descends and fills the space and everyone realizes God approves. All right, that's visual one. Visual two is Moses taps in the last peg and bam! The entire place is filled with the presence of God and everyone is almost thrown back by this explosion of divinity in their midst. What's the difference?
Well, what came to mind is that's how you wind up with the Chabad mobiles and tefillin, in the sense that it's like, it's more akin to a light switch
Mm-hmm.
and the light going on,
Mhm.
then progressive approximation to a goal. Everything has to be in place.
Right.
And if you have everything in place, boom, it happens.
Right. And if you don't,
If you don't, that light's not going on.
right. And that metaphor that Sforno is bringing here is a very powerful one. What she is saying is that this tabernacle didn't just achieve its goals because everybody believed in it, because everybody appreciated it, because everybody liked it. It achieved its goal because it was done right. And as soon as it was done, because it was right, it achieved that goal instantly. It wasn't about how they felt about it. It was about what they had achieved by their concrete actions. And that is something that we can contemplate and savor when it comes to our own actions, right? When we do what is right, when we approach God, when we approach each other, when we do a mitzvah that is done right, it is like a light switch, right? There is a immediate connection with another human being, with the divine, with our history, lots of different connections that are going because you did it. You don't have to always build up to it. Yes, you can deepen that connection, you can broaden that connection, you can find it in ways that you were unaware of before, but the connection itself is always there, ready to go as soon as you plug it in. And that's what it's saying, is that God's presence is there when you're ready to plug in. And that's different than if you have the let's stand back and admire our work moment. And Sforno was getting rid of that by saying it was an immediate effect, that God's presence is available to be plugged into when you do it right. And that's what makes this different than just building a building. This was building it's like plugging in the radar tower, right? As soon as you plug it in, beep, beep, you're getting the signal.
So can you reason from that if it's so important to do it right, that's why we spent 4 chapters planning and designing and developing and implementing and testing?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. You can clearly see that all of those chapters and its precision mattered, especially when you add it to the notion of what Barbanel was saying, which was that part of why it mattered is because this is meant to be a parallel of our understanding of creation as a whole. That the Mishkan is not just your run-of-the-mill building. This is a building designed by God with a very specific reason of what will happen when it is done this way. And that's different than it might be done if it was done differently, like just building a house. So yes, absolutely. This from this little phrase, Sforno is changing the whole dynamic of the construction by saying it happened instantly. All right. There's another way, though, that we can also learn something very profound and very deep from these tiny little words.
The term male is a homonym, which denotes that one substance enters another and fills it, as in Genesis, Exodus, and many other instances.
Right, so male is our key word, where it says that this kavod Adonai, this glory of God, male, it fills this space. And so Rambam is going to try and tell us, what does male mean? And one thing that it means, which we're mostly familiar with, is one thing takes up all the space in another thing. I fill my glass with water. We all know what that word means, and it means the same thing in Hebrew when you say that. But it's a homonym, which means that it's got more than one meaning, even though it sounds the same.
Next, it signifies the expiration or completion of a fixed period of time, as in 2 chapters in Genesis.
Right. So if we say, you fill your days, right? That means the time is done, right? The time is filled. That means the time has expired. Not exactly a common English idiom, but it works in the Hebrew.
Also, the attainment of the highest degree of excellency, as in Deuteronomy, Exodus, and 1 Kings.
Right. So to be full is to also to achieve this level of perfection, of greatness. And this is where we're going to go with it.
In this sense, it is said, the whole earth is full, melo, of his glory. And that's from Isaiah.
Exactly. The whole world is full of his glory. The whole world is full of his glory. Well, I thought the whole tabernacle was filled with his glory. Not the whole world, Isaiah. I mean, and I thought that when God's whole glory filled everything, we all got flung backwards. So, But wow.
All the earth gives evidence of his perfection, that is, leads to a knowledge of it. Thus also the glory of the Lord filled Ma'ale, the tabernacle. And in fact, every application of the word to God must be interpreted in this manner, and not that he has a body occupying space.
All right, so he wants to rule out the body thing, but look what he's doing in between there. He's saying that when we say the world is filled with God's glory, when we say the tabernacle is filled with God's glory, we are saying that all the earth gives evidence to God's perfection. Right? When it's full, that means it is excellent. If the world is filled by God's glory, it means the world has been made excellent by God. Therefore, by knowing the excellence of the world, we know the excellence of God. When we say the tabernacle was filled with God's glory, it means when we look at it perfect in its completion and what it achieved, we reflect, we understand more about God's perfection. It doesn't have to even be anything like a physical cloud. It just has to be that the tabernacle itself was full of this evidence of God's perfection. If you've ever read a passage of Torah or Jewish law, and you looked at that and said, that is an amazing statement of compassion or of human insight or of the beauty of what this world should be, and you've reflected a little bit of what a God that gave us this. That's what Rambam is saying. If you've ever been out in the natural world and you've seen something that was beautiful and moving and you thought how wondrous was God's creation, what a miracle that God made this. That's what he's saying, is that God's glory is all around us constantly, the evidence of God's perfection and beauty and wonder, if we notice it. We notice it at the tabernacle. We should be noticing it day by day because both the tabernacle and the whole world are constantly full of it. That sounded wrong.
That sounded wrong.
Are constantly filled with this evidence of God's greatness. That sounds better. But Rambam is also going to give us a second opinion because the Torah has 70 faces.
If, on the other hand, you prefer to think that in this passage, by the glory of the Lord, a certain light created for the purpose is to be understood, that such light is always termed glory, and that such light filled the tabernacle, we have no objection.
That's okay.
Oh,
That's not the way Rambam personally interprets it.
yeah.
But if you want to say the glory of God was the shining light, that's okay, because remember Rambam was most worried that you might think that the cloud represented God's body. And God can't have a body, God can't have a singular location, because if he did, God wouldn't be God. So if you want to call it a light that represented God, that was created by God but is not God, that's okay too, because you haven't gone over that line of anthropomorphizing God into having a body. So he'll keep that as a backup, and if that's your interpretation, go for it.
Well, if you walk into a room that's filled with a cloud and you can't see anything, you tend to think of that cloud as being something there. But you walk into a room filled with light, you can see everything, and you can still be there at the same time as God is there, and you could both be in the same place.
But God is everywhere.
God is everywhere.
But
But
that's what Rambam is.
And this lets you understand how God can be everywhere if you think of it as light. It's a very good explanation.
Okay, and so seeing God's presence, and what does it mean to see God's presence, is going to be our linkage into our final text. And we're going to come back to the fire. I told you we get there.
Oh, yes. The presence of the Lord in the Bible refers to two different things: to the light that the Israelites could see inside the cloud, and more correctly, to the higher spiritual presence that our sages call the Shekhinah.
Right? So we have this light that is the presence of God that usually gets called Shekhinah in rabbinic literature, which means the indwelling presence, and it comes from the word to mean to dwell, which, by the way, is exactly the word. I'll turn the page. That you'll find used over and over again in our verses in the Hebrew, where it says that it settled upon or dwelled within. That comes from the Hebrew word for Shekhinah, for dwelling, as opposed to the cloud, which was a cloud. So the light was there and the cloud was there, but two things were happening at once. You had a visual manifestation, and you had the higher spiritual presence. And that means both the cloud and the fire were always there. But
the cloud was visible during the day, and at night, when it was too dark to see the cloud, the light within it was visible.
because the question would become, was the cloud turning off and the light and the fire turning on? And then in the morning, the fire turned off and the cloud turned on. And Abarbanel saying, no, they were both constantly there. During the day, you just couldn't see the light. And during the day, it was too bright and the light didn't stand out. Turn off the lights, and all of a sudden, that light is much more visible. A good reminder of this exact same effect is how many stars are currently above us? Right? All of them. They don't go away just because the sun comes up. You just can't see the stars because the sun is so bright. So too, during the day, seeing this presence of God wasn't always immediately visible to the people, but they could see the cloud. At night, then the presence was more visible. And that metaphor has continued to guide us both with comfort and with rebuke and warning over and over again throughout the Torah and throughout later. The idea that we need to be able to see God's presence when it is darkest, when it is most dim, when life is most dark, that we will often find God more clearly than we do at other times, has been a source of comfort to our people and of strength, that when things get worse, we sometimes find a spiritual strength and energy that we didn't have when things weren't so bad. And on the other end of that spectrum, oftentimes when things are going really, really well, when it's full daylight out, we stop noticing the light that is always there, and we drift away from it. We stop looking at it, which is why some of our most challenging periods in Jewish history have been our successes rather than our challenges. And we need to still be able to see the light even when it's not abysmally dark outside, because the light is still there. All right, so not bad for a tiny sliver of text. I think Ralbag was right when he said that these short pieces are full of a lot of profound ideas. And like I said, this is an extremely abbreviated selection of our commentary on this section from our tradition. So I highly recommend you keep studying.
Oh, goodness.
And next week, Vayikra.
Yay.
Yes, let me just hit stop here.